The night smelled of scorched tobacco and cold November air, the kind of night where a man's breath turns to steam and every shadow feels like it's holding its own secret. Records describe the room as still, too still, except for the soft crackle of a cigar burning itself toward the nub. And somewhere in that silence stood a man most folks never noticed, a man whose footsteps blended into the floorboards, whose voice rarely carried, whose anger lived quiet and patient. Men who later studied the scene recalled the way the smoke hung in the air like a warning. They said the master's hands were locked in a final clawed grip, lips stained dark, eyes frozen wide, as if he'd realized too late that the world he controlled had finally turned on him. And at the center of it all was tobacco, the very thing that built his life, now tearing it apart one breath at a time. Some stories are loud. This one kills in silence. If you're into hidden histories, cold night mysteries, and the kind of stories men whispered about for generations, stick around. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Hit the sub button if you haven't already, and let's go deeper into a truth that sat buried for over a century. You're going to want to see where this Lee, the frost-bitten morning carried the scent of damp earth as a lone man crossed the yard, boots crushing brittle leaves, his breath rising in thin trails like smoke from an unseen fire beneath his ribs. He walked with a quiet steadiness, the kind men overlooked until the day they realized he'd been studying every inch of the world, memorizing the way it breathed, shifted, and revealed its weakest joints. Records from the old outpost describe him as ordinary, a man whose shoulders bore years of unspoken strain, whose silence made other men comfortable enough to underestimate him completely. Yet there was something in his eyes, an ember-like intensity, that suggested he carried memories sharp enough to cut through the calm any morning that dared pretend the world was simple. Men who worked beside him later recalled how he handled every tool like it belonged to him, how his grip always tightened for a moment too long, like he was testing the weight of every choice he'd ever made. The outpost itself sat along a crooked river, wooden cabins leaning with age, smoke drifting from chimneys where men warmed hands scarred by winters harsher than truth. Those cabins echoed with the sounds of boots scraping on floorboards, mugs hitting rough tables, and the restless shifting of men who knew survival demanded more than strength alone. Among them stood Garin, the overseer of supply routes, a man carved from sharp angles and old bitterness, whose authority rested on fear more than competence. Garin believed fear kept order, and order kept him powerful, though the records suggest his rule was built more on bluster than any real backbone forged in hardship. The men followed him because they had no choice, because the outpost was isolated, supplies thin, and winter pressed against the walls like a beast demanding tribute. In that harsh place walked Lanton, the quiet laborer with calloused hands and a gaze that drifted toward the tree line, as if he saw paths no one else could see. No one knew much about Lanton except that he worked harder than most, spoke less than any, and carried a past that clung to him like smoke on old wool. Some claimed he'd lost brothers to a betrayal back east. Others believed he'd walked away from a life of comfort to pay an unnamed debt carved somewhere deep inside his chest. Whatever truth lay beneath the rumors, what mattered was the tension between him and Garin, a slow current of resentment that thickened the air whenever they stood too close. One frigid afternoon, Garin berated a younger man for dropping a crate, his voice cracking through the yard like a whip, leaving the others staring at their boots. Lanton stood nearby, jaw tight, eyes steady, watching the scene with a focus that made some men glance nervously between them, sensing something shifting beneath the surface. Garin noticed the stare and stepped closer, challenging the silence with the arrogance of a man who believed respect could be forced through intimidation alone. But Lanton didn't flinch, didn't lower his gaze, didn't apologize for witnessing cruelty. He simply breathed, slow and measured, as if deciding whether the moment required action. Witnesses later described the way Garin's smirk faltered, how his voice cracked just slightly, how he seemed to suddenly realize quiet men could be dangerous too. From that day forward, Garin kept a closer watch on Lanton, convinced that beneath the calm exterior lived a threat waiting for a reason to ignite. The men in the bunkhouse whispered at night about tensions rising like storm clouds, about the feeling that something significant was shifting in the cold air. The river beside the outpost froze in jagged sheets. The current slowed but never stopped, mirroring the way Lanton moved steady on the surface, relentless underneath. He spent evenings repairing broken tools, the glow of lantern light catching his features, carving lines of determination into a face that rarely betrayed emotion. That discipline drew quiet respect from the others, men who recognized in him the rare strength of someone who endured instead of boasting. Garin, threatened by that quiet influence, began assigning Lanton the most punishing tasks, hoping exhaustion might break his resolve or force him into a misstep. But each time Lanton returned from the freezing forest or the collapsing storage shed, he carried himself with the same steady composure, unshaken and unreadable. The more Garin pushed, the more the others watched, sensing the brewing conflict but unsure which man held the advantage as winter tightened its grip. Evening logs from the outpost note an unusual silence settling across the camp, the kind that arrives before something inevitable shifts the balance of power. Men felt it in their bones, in the way conversations trailed off, in the way footsteps echoed too loudly across frozen ground. And at the center of that silence stood Lanton, hands scarred, breath steady, preparing for a reckoning he'd carried within him long before winter ever came. By the time the first real storm rolled over the ridgeline, every man in the outpost understood one thing clearly. Something was coming, and it carried Lanton's shadow. The storm arrived before dawn, hammering the cabins with sleet that stung like grit, while men inside tightened their coats and listened to the wind drag its fingers across the roofs, like something searching for entry. Lanton stood at the doorway of the supply shed, shoulders squared against the cold, watching great clouds churn as if the sky itself wrestled with something it couldn't quite contain. The outpost bell rang twice, a summons that echoed through the frozen yard and pulled every man from his bunk with the urgency of looming trouble more than routine duty. Garin emerged from his cabin wrapped in a thick coat, jaw clenched, eyes sharp with the brittle authority of someone determined to reassert control before daylight exposed his insecurities. The men gathered in stiff rows near the supply shed, boots sinking into slush, breath rising like faint torches in the dim morning as Garin scanned their faces with calculated scrutiny. The supply cart had vanished overnight, tracks cutting through the snow toward the ridge, and Garin's voice cracked like snapped timber as he demanded answers none of them had. Lanton stood motionless, studying the tracks, noting the inconsistent wheel ruts that suggested panic rather than skilled planning, a detail Garin completely missed in his frantic accusations. Men shifted uncomfortably as Garin paced, his frustration building into sharp outbursts, each word revealing fear he tried desperately to bury beneath bluster and rigid posture. The storm intensified, sleet rattling against crates and barrels, but Lanton barely blinked, eyes fixed on the distant ridge as though measuring distances invisible to everyone else. When Garin stepped toward him, demanding explanation, Lanton answered with steady calm, describing the rushed nature of the tracks and hinting at another man's desperation rather than conspiracy. Garin bristled at being out-analyzed in front of the crew, cheeks reddening beneath the cold, as resentment tightened every line of his posture with dangerous rigidity. The wind tore across the yard, carrying the faint groan of shifting ice on the river, a sound that seemed to underline the tension gathering between the two men. One of the younger workers suggested retrieving the stolen cart, but Garin dismissed him harshly, insisting authority rested with him and him alone, despite mounting evidence of his incompetence. Lanton remained still, absorbing Garin's outburst like a stone absorbs rain. Unmoved and unshaken, his silence louder than any argument he could have offered. The men exchanged uneasy glances, each recognizing the imbalance between Garin's anger and Lanton's impenetrable calm, a contrast that grew sharper with every passing minute. As the storm softened briefly, Lanton walked toward the ridge to examine the trail more closely, ignoring Garin's sputtered command to stay put and respect the chain of command. Footsteps crunched behind him as two other men followed, drawn more by quiet trust than spoken loyalty, recognizing that Lanton's judgment had saved them before. The ridge offered a clearer view of the valley, where faint signs indicated the stolen cart had not made it far before veering into dense, ice-heavy brush. Lanton crouched low, gloved fingers brushing the disturbed snow, his breathing slow, and even as he read the terrain like a man reading a journal written in scars. The others waited, letting silence stretch, knowing Lanton needed space to piece together movements and motives hidden beneath the churned path and scattered fragments of broken wood. Within moments he understood the truth. The thief was injured, moving erratically, driven by fear or hunger intense enough to override caution, a man cornered by his own desperation. He rose slowly, gaze drifting toward the river bends where mist clung low, hiding shapes that could be shelter or danger depending on which man reached them first. Garin arrived moments later, panting, coat flapping wildly, shouting accusations at everyone except himself, desperate to reclaim authority, slipping like thawing ice beneath his boots. But when he demanded Lanton speak, the quiet man simply pointed toward the riverbank, offering clear direction without a single wasted word, letting the evidence speak louder than command. The men followed his lead instinctively, leaving Garin to trail behind them, his fury swallowed by the wind as he realized influence was shifting away from him. Down near the river, shattered branches and a bloodied handprint on a fallen log revealed the thief's struggle, the kind of sign that pulled men into somber focus. Lanton knelt again, fingertips tracing the mark with a gentleness that contrasted the storm's brutality, as if honoring the silent pain represented. He stood with slow purpose, eyes narrowing toward a narrow ravine half hidden by ice, where the snow was disturbed enough to suggest a man had crawled through seeking refuge. Tension tightened across the crew as they realized whoever hid within that ravine might be cornered, desperate, or dying, and the next steps required calm only Lanton possessed. Without hesitation, Lanton stepped forward, boots sinking into deep snow, his posture steady, his resolve unbroken, carrying the weight of unspoken responsibility thicker than the storm clouds overhead. And as he entered the ravine's shadowed mouth, men watching from behind understood that whatever they found inside would shift the outpost's fragile balance forever. Snow muffled every sound as Lanton stepped deeper into the ravine, the walls narrowing around him until the wind faded and only his steady breathing filled the cold, tightening air. Frost clung to jagged stone like pale armor, and beneath it lay tracks that wavered, staggered, and finally collapsed into a single knee-shaped indentation marked by strained effort. Lanton lowered himself beside the impression, fingertips brushing the snow with deliberate calm as he mapped the thief's final movements through chilled memory and bruised footprints. Ahead, the ravine dipped into a hollow where shadows pooled, thick as iron smoke, and within that darkness lay the shape of a man curled tightly against the cold. The thief's coat was torn, his hands scraped raw, his face pale beneath a thick beard, but his eyes flickered open the moment Lanton knelt beside him. His voice was barely more than a rasp, broken by panic and frostbite, admitting through clenched teeth that desperation, not betrayal, had driven him into the blizzard. He'd stolen the cart searching for medicine buried in the supplies, hoping to treat a lung infection that had worsened during the last brutal freeze. Lanton listened without judgment, watching frost gather in the man's beard as breath escaped in fading clouds that trembled with fear and guilt. Up on the ridge, the others waited anxiously, their figures barely visible through swirling gusts as they watched Lanton lean closer to the injured man. The thief trembled, expecting anger or punishment, but Lanton instead gripped his shoulder firmly, grounding him with a silent steadiness forged from harder winters. As Lanton helped him sit upright, the man winced, clutching his side where bruising spread beneath torn cloth like storm clouds gathering against bone. The ravine groaned softly as shifting ice cracked somewhere above, sending small shards cascading down in sharp, glittering fragments that bounced near their boots. Lanton signaled the others with a raised hand, urging them to approach carefully as he eased the injured man's breathing with slow, measured guidance. Garin forced his way down first, slipping on the ice, his expression twisting with fury as he pointed accusingly at the weakened figure slumped against stone. The injured man flinched, expecting violence, but Lanton stepped between them. His stance calm yet immovable, a silent barrier forged from unspoken authority. Garin barked accusations, demanding immediate punishment, his breath forming angry clouds that dissolved into the icy air as he gestured wildly. But the others, standing along the ravine wall, said nothing, watching Lanton instead, trusting his judgment more than Durin's bluster-filled rage. Lanton's voice finally broke the tension, low and steady, explaining the man's desperation and the reason behind the theft with a clarity Garin couldn't dismiss. The wind cut sharply through the ravine, swirling between the men as if waiting to see which direction their fractured loyalties would settle. Garin tried to reassert dominance, stepping forward with clenched fist, but the injured man's collapse into heavy coughing silenced his threats immediately. Blood spotted the snow, dark and startling against the frost, drawing grim recognition from the others that anger wouldn't fix what sickness had started. Lanton motioned for two men to assist, and they obeyed without hesitation, lifting the weakened figure carefully, mindful of his labored breaths. Garin sputtered objections, but no one acknowledged them, the cold revealing which man truly held influence within the outpost's fragile hierarchy. Together they climbed from the ravine, boots slipping on ice, muscles straining, carrying the thief through swirling snow toward the faint lamps of the cabins. Lanton walked beside them, hand steadying the man's shoulder, eyes fixed forward with the unwavering focus of someone who refused to let another life slip away unnoticed. Inside the outpost infirmary, a fire crackled weakly, offering thin warmth as Lanton helped settle the injured man onto a cot with deliberate care. The others gathered silently, forming a protective semicircle as the man's breathing steadied under Lanton's watchful presence. Even in the dim light, Lanton's expression held a depth of resolve older than the storm, a quiet understanding forged through years of carrying burdens no one else saw. Garin lingered in the doorway, seething but powerless, realizing the storm outside was nothing compared to the shifting power within the outpost walls. And as the wind howled against the windows, every man understood that Lanton's calm leadership had changed something permanent, reshaping loyalties in ways no command ever could. The storm eased by midnight, leaving the outpost wrapped in thick silence as men huddled near dying fires, their breaths drifting upward like thin ghosts rising from worn lungs. Lanton stepped outside into the cold, boots crunching through frost as he surveyed the shadows stretching across the yard, each one carrying tension heavier than any drifting snow. Word of the rescued thief had spread quickly, binding the men in quiet unity even as Garin paced angrily through the camp, his authority slipping like ice beneath thawing ground. The river groaned in the darkness, sheets of frozen water cracking with deep, echoing tones that sounded almost like warnings carried through timber-rich air. Lanton paused near the bank, studying the jagged edges where ice met flowing current, noting how fractures spread in patterns resembling choices men feared to confront. Behind him, footsteps approached cautiously, belonging to one of the younger workers who'd watched Lanton's decisions reshape the outpost's fragile order during the storm. The young man spoke softly, admitting gratitude for Lanton's calm, describing how fear had hung over the outpost long before the blizzard exposed its brittle fractures. Lanton listened in stillness, offering no grand speeches, only the presence of a man who understood that leadership grew from steady action rather than raised voices. Garin's shout broke the quiet, echoing from the supply cabin as he berated two men for inventory errors caused by the storm's chaos rather than their negligence. The younger worker flinched at the sound, glancing toward Lanton with worry, sensing the confrontation brewing like embers waiting for the slightest breath to ignite. Inside the main cabin, the rescued thief lay sleeping fitfully, sweating through feverish chills despite blankets piled thick upon him by men determined to help. Lanton entered briefly, feeling the man's forehead, noting the dangerous warmth rising beneath skin chilled earlier by frostbite and desperation. The others watched Lanton closely, trusting his steadiness more than any written protocol, especially when sickness threatened someone who'd already suffered at the edge of death. Garin barged in suddenly, demanding custody of the thief, claiming punishment must be delivered before weakness infected the camp like spreading fog. His words rang harshly against timber walls, But the men surrounding the cot didn't move, their silence forming a barrier sturdier than any locked door. Lanton stepped forward, placing himself directly between Garin and the injured man, posture calm yet immovable, radiating a stillness that felt colder than the winter outside. Garin's fury flared as he reached for Lanton's coat, grabbing tightly, but Lanton's hand closed around Garin's wrist with deliberate strength that forced stillness through sheer restraint. The room froze, every man holding breath, watching authority and resolve collide without raised fists or shouted threats, only tightly controlled tension bound by old scars. Garin pulled free, stumbling back as his rage faltered, meeting the steady eyes of men who no longer feared him, no longer recognized his voice as law. He stormed outside, slamming the door hard enough to shake frost from the rafters, leaving the room vibrating with the aftershock of a power shift long in motion. Later, Lanton stepped into the night again, tracking Garin's footprints across frozen ground toward the river, where the overseer stood hunched beneath towering pines. The wind pressed against their coats as Lanton approached, and Garin turned, face twisted in a mixture of pride, fear, and the dawning realization he'd already lost. He accused Lanton of undermining his authority, insisting the outpost needed discipline forged through obedience, not compassion, his voice cracking beneath the brittle edge of desperation. Lanton replied with calm finality, stating the men required stability, fairness, and truth, elements Garin had neglected while clinging to a crumbling throne of intimidation. Garin stepped back toward the river's edge, ice snapping beneath his heel, as the wind carried thin mist across the dark water shifting beneath frozen layers. The icy ground betrayed him suddenly, collapsing under his weight, throwing him onto the river's cracked surface where thin ice groaned beneath his panicked struggle. Lanton surged forward, gripping Garin's coat collar just before the surface gave way, hauling him towards solid ground with practiced strength born from countless winters. Garin collapsed on the bank, chest heaving, eyes widened with shock as he stared at the cracked ice that had nearly claimed his life in a single misstep. He looked up at Lanton with trembling disbelief, realizing the man he'd tried to break had just saved him without hesitation or resentment. The wind softened as Garin lowered his gaze, acknowledging through silence what pride refused to speak, surrendering leadership to the man who had earned it without seeking power. By dawn, the outpost was calmer, men working with quiet determination, their trust now anchored in Lanton's steady guidance rather than Garin's vanished authority. And as the river thawed slowly under first light, every man understood winter had changed more than the land. It had reshaped the bonds that determined who they followed.